Hey everyone, please support what I do to help keep Greyhawk alive by subscribing to the channel. Also, please consider becoming a channel member to get early access to videos, exclusive live chats, quarterly adventure modules, and more. Thanks, and enjoy the show. So, obviously, more gamers are familiar with the Forgotten Realms today than they are familiar with Greyhawk, and I wanted to talk about the differences between the two today on Greyhawk Grognard. Now, obviously, because the Forgotten Realms is the default setting for 5th edition D&D, there's going to be a lot more gamers who are familiar with the Realms than are familiar with Greyhawk, which really hasn't been a current setting since, 3.5. There's been some products here and there, some adventures and such, and of course there's a vibrant fan community, but there really hasn't been any major official support in many years, as opposed to the Forgotten Realms, which has, umpteen zillion things coming out for it. So naturally, gamers today, especially new gamers, are going to be familiar with that, and if they've heard of Greyhawk, they're not going to really know what it's about. And on the surface, they are pretty similar. They're both quasi-medieval European fantasy settings. And if you don't look any deeper, that's it. They're very similar on that high 10,000 foot superficial level. However, when you look deeper into each setting, there are a lot of differences. And although I am, of course, my first love is Greyhawk, I like the Realms. I was a big Realms fan for a long time in the back when it first came out, the gray box and everything. I thought it was great. I was a huge fan of Ed Greenwood's Dragon Magazine articles, where he had would go into these really descriptive, dripping with lore articles about magic items and spells, and some of his work on just generic, how to run a campaign. Those articles are fantastic. So please don't take this as I'm trashing the Realms, because I'm not. I like the Realms. It's just not my first go-to. And I think the first point of difference between the two would be the level of detail. And this is obvious. This is the 800-pound gorilla with the Realms. And in the Realms case, it's the 80,000-pound gorilla. Because there is just so much material. There's box sets, there's novels, adventures, articles. It is completely possible for a DM or a player who really wants to get into the setting to just be overwhelmed by this mountain of stuff. And I know personally, one of the reasons I don't run in the Forgotten Realms is I'm afraid that I will be I'll be violating canon. I'll say something that turns out that in some book from the 90s said something else, and how am I supposed to reconcile that? And unless I am that fully conversant in the Realms, I might as well do a homebrew campaign and just take in stuff, here and there from the Forgotten Realms. And I think that's there is a certain level of intimidation in that sense when it comes to the Forgotten Realms, in terms of just how much information is out there and how much information you would be expected to master. And obviously not everybody cares that much about it. Who cares if you contradicted this book in the 90s? But the mere fact that it's there, and to me, does make a difference. And I want to, if I'm going to be running a game, I want to know everything that's going on in that setting. So, on the other hand, you have Greyhawk, which from its inception was much more minimalist. When it was first published in the folio, you only had 48 pages, 32 pages, something like that, of material, and that was it. Entire nations got a couple of paragraphs. There was maybe a page of history, and there were no deities. There was, it was very, very minimalist, deliberately to allow and in fact require the DM to fill in those gaps. You needed to be creative in order to use Greyhawk, and that was part of its strength, that was its charm, was that it left so much open, it allowed the DM to make Greyhawk his own, or her own. The Realms, on the other hand, is so filled in, every nook and cranny is completely covered somewhere. It makes it almost stifles creativity. Whereas Greyhawk, especially in the earliest years, was the exact opposite. It was so sparse and so Spartan that it required creativity. And of course, over the years, things got filled in. They did the deities. They did source books for IUs and the Marklands and so forth. But even to this, and of course, the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer filled in a lot of material. It was, in my opinion, too much. But even today, after all of those, 43 years of published stuff for the World of Greyhawk, there are still enormous areas of the setting that have only the most superficial treatment. Kaoland is a great example. We have some adventure modules that take place on the western verges, in Joff and so forth. But Kaoland itself, it's almost a cipher. You almost don't know anything about it. The name of the king and not all that much else. Which would be unthinkable in the Forgotten Realms, to have an entire region that takes up maybe a quarter of the entire continent. Just, we don't know. It's up to the DM. And of course, when they first rolled out the Forgotten Realms, they said that they were going to leave one of the countries, I think it's Sembia, but I might be wrong. They weren't going to detail it. They were just going to let it alone, and the DM could do whatever they wanted to do with it. And of course, within a couple of years, that went by the books. They did a Sembia source book or whatever it was. So they were conscious of this. They just didn't remain so. So that's really, to my mind, one of the chief differences between the two. Is the level of detail. On the one hand, Realms has enormous amounts of detail that can be intimidating and stifle creativity. On the other hand, you have Greyhawk, which has a relatively low level of detail and actually requires creativity to fill in those gaps. Now, another difference between the two is the power level, one might say, where the Forgotten Realms really is a high fantasy in the sense of there are high levels of magic all over the place. There are 16th, 20th level magic users wandering around in relative abundance. There are entire civilizations that use magic the way we use technology, to do everyday things. It's very high powered and very magically inundated. And you see this with high-level NPCs all over the place. Elminster, obviously, is the big example. You've got this, 30th level magic user running around sending you all on quests. It very much permeates the setting that, everything here is magic, and there are enormously powerful characters that, that exist and could, if they chose, squash most player characters. Greyhawk, on the other hand, is a relatively low magic setting. And again, this was deliberate. And it might be a little different from Gary's home game, where, everything was centered around Castle Greyhawk, so there was quite a profusion of magic items and so forth. A lot of that, too, bear in mind, was because he needed to playtest these things. So if he comes up with a new magic item, he needs to give it to his players in order to see what impact it has on the campaign. But on the whole, you don't have these Elminster-esque characters running around in Greyhawk. You don't have this enormous profusion of 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th level characters. Kings listed in the guide to the World of Greyhawk. Kings of countries are like 12th level. So the power level is much lower, and the magic level is also relatively low. There are obviously exceptions. There's the castle. There's the Castle Greyhawk is perfect example. It's a high magic area. But the setting as a whole is not really geared towards, there's monsters everywhere, and there's magic items scattered around everywhere you go. Which is, you kind of get that impression from the Forgotten Realms, because there is so much of that material that has been written over the years. This goes back to the first point. But you don't see that in Greyhawk nearly as much. The levels are lower, you find lower amounts of magic items. The whole thing just feels more swords and sorcery than high fantasy. And I think that's another big difference, is that Greyhawk feels a little more gritty. Whereas Forgotten Realms feels a little more pretty. And it's a very real distinction. And it's just, of course, obviously it is not a hard and fast rule. You can run a swords and sorcery lower magic game in the Forgotten Realms, just like you can run a high magic, high fantasy game in Greyhawk. It's not to say it can't be done. I'm talking about the setting, in whole, in the generic sense. So there's another point of difference, is you've got, high magic, high level on one side, and you've got lower magic, lower level on the other. And a third one, I'm only going to go three. There's a lot more differences that you could come up with. But a third one that I would bring up is that Greyhawk feels a little more kit-bashed. It feels like it grew organically over the course of time, which of course it did, as part of the D&D game that Gary was running, and then afterwards, after other authors picked it up, and it similarly grew that way. And you see this in things like Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, where you have a crashed spaceship in the setting. You can have these things that feel incongruous because they were a good idea at the time. And they made for a good adventure. And that was more the driving force. Whereas the Forgotten Realms, it feels more of a complete, holistic, polished thing. And you don't get that nearly as much of a sense of, okay, now my player's moved out here, now I need to figure out what's there. You really get the sense of, it was created, formed whole from the brow of Zeus, and or from the brow of Ed Greenwood, and just out it came, fully formed. Whereas Greyhawk feels a lot less like that, and does have a lot more of a incongruous feel at times. There's things that don't quite feel like they belong, but in my mind, that actually makes the setting feel more realistic. Take Blackmoor in the northern part of Greyhawk. It doesn't really have any purpose for being there. It was obviously a completely other campaign, Dave Arneson's campaign, that Gary thought, let's just pop it in there. And then later on, of course, he just said it was a great name, but nobody believed that. Look at the map; it's the same. Whereas in the Forgotten Realms, you don't really get that. Everything feels very homogenized in the Forgotten Realms. Whereas in the World of Greyhawk, you get a lot more. It's more rocky road. You got some patches here that don't doesn't flow perfectly, but in that not flowing perfectly, it actually feels more realistic, because life does not flow perfectly. Nature does not flow perfectly. There are anomalous things out there, and you get a lot more of that feel in the World of Greyhawk. And not to put too fine a point on it, the World of Greyhawk is only one part of one continent. It's just the Flanaess, really. There's the Sundered Empire way off to the west, but all the stuff in between, we have one map and two maps and a handful of names, and that's about it. Whereas everything in Forgotten Realms is pretty much, I think they've mapped out the entire globe, and that allows you to have that kind of anomalies that can crop up, because as you're the DM, you're pushing the boundaries out and out and out into the continent of Orc, then you can have just kind of incongruous things happen, and incongruous places just kind of show up. because it's necessary for the game you're playing. And I kind of like that. I like the fact that Greyhawk is less homogenous and less fully formed and holistic than the Forgotten Realms, and that's that for me. That's the big three here. So those are my top three differences between Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What would you say differentiates Greyhawk from the Realms? Are there things that you think are really important that I skipped over? Did I overemphasize some point? I would love to hear your thoughts on this question. Please let me know in the comments. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and stay safe from Pinkertons. Thanks for watching today's video. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Below you'll find links to my Patreon, which helps make these videos possible. You'll also find the web store where you can buy my books, and my blog where you'll find all sorts of free downloads and other articles. Thanks, and have a great day.